The old woman pushed her rusty shopping cart down Fifth Street, the wheels squeaking with every turn. Her name was Margaret, though most people in downtown Portland didn't bother to ask. To them, she was just another homeless person cluttering up the sidewalk. Someone to step around and forget about as quickly as possible. It was a cold Thursday afternoon in October, and Margaret wore 3 layers of clothing that had seen better days. Her gray hair stuck out from beneath a knit cap that had lost its shape years ago. Her hands, wrapped in fingerless gloves, gripped the cart handle as she made her way past the busy coffee shops and restaurants where people sat warm and comfortable inside. She had learned to make herself small, to take up as little space as possible. It was easier that way. Less confrontation. Less hatred in people's eyes. At 68 years old, she had perfected the art of being invisible. But being invisible didn't always work. Hey, you can't stay here. A man in a crisp white shirt came storming out of a bakery, waving his hands at Margaret like she was a stray dog. You're driving away my customers. Move along. Margaret didn't argue. She never did anymore. She simply nodded and pushed her cart further down the block, her eyes fixed on the cracked pavement beneath her feet. Behind her, she could hear the man muttering to someone about these people and how they were ruining the neighborhood. She had heard it all before, 1,000 times. In 1,000 different ways, Margaret found her usual spot on a wooden bench near the corner of 5th and Morrison. It wasn't much, but it was something. The bench sat in front of a bank that closed at 5, which meant she could rest there for a while in the late afternoon without being bothered. Usually from her cart. She pulled out a book. The cover was barely hanging on, held together with tape that had turned yellow with age. The Count of Monte Cristo was printed in faded letters across the front. She had read it at least a dozen times, but it was one of the few possessions she had managed to keep through everything. The library had been about to throw it away years ago, and she had asked if she could have it. Back when she still went to the library, back before they started watching her too closely, suspecting she might steal something or cause trouble, she opened the book carefully, treating it like the treasure it was, and began to read. The words transported her somewhere else, somewhere far away from the cold bench and the hostile stares. For a little while, she could be someone else, someone who mattered. Excuse me, ma'am. I think you need to keep moving. Margaret looked up to find a young security guard standing over her. He couldn't have been more than 25, with a name tag that read Steve pinned to his uniform. The bank manager called, he said, not quite meeting her eyes. They say you're making customers uncomfortable. Margaret glanced at the bank windows. She could see people inside, standing in line for the ATM, conducting their business. Not one of them was looking at her. But she knew how this worked. It didn't matter if she was actually bothering anyone. It only mattered that someone decided she might. She closed her book and stood up slowly, her joints aching from the cold. Without a word, she gripped her cart and started walking again. The security guard watched her go, and she wondered if he felt bad about it. Probably not. Most people had gotten very good at not feeling bad. About half a block down, she passed a woman talking loudly on her phone. The woman took one look at Margaret in her cart and immediately stepped off the curb into the street. Still talking as if getting that close to a homeless person might be contagious, Margaret had stopped taking it personally years ago. That was just how the world worked now. She was less than nothing in their eyes. She finally settled on some steps leading up to an old church. The church itself was rarely open except on Sundays, but the steps were public property, and she had learned which spots in the city would tolerate her presence for an hour or two. She sat down, pulled her thin jacket tighter around her shoulders, and opened her book again. The words on the page blurred together. She had been having trouble with her eyes lately, but glasses cost money she didn't have. Still, she knew these passages almost by heart. She could fill in the parts she couldn't quite see. That's when she noticed him. A teenage boy, maybe 16 or 17, had stopped on the sidewalk a few feet away. He was looking at her, but not in the way people usually looked at her. There was no disgust on his face, no fear. No pity either, which somehow felt worse than the disgust. He just looked curious. Margaret glanced away quickly, hoping he would keep walking. Young people could be unpredictable. Sometimes they were cruel just for entertainment. Filming homeless people on their phones for social media, laughing at them with their friends. She didn't need that today. But the boy didn't move. After a moment, he spoke. "Is that the Count of Monte Cristo?" Margaret looked up again, surprised. He was pointing at her book. "Yes," she said quietly, her voice rough from not using it much during the day. "That's a great book," the boy said, adjusting the backpack on his shoulder. "We read it in my English class last year." "Well, part of it. The whole thing is really long." Margaret nodded slowly, unsure what to say. Was this a trick? Some kind of joke? "I'm Danny," the boy said. "I work at the library down the street. Part-time, after school." "Margaret," she replied, though she immediately wondered why she had given him her real name. She usually didn't talk to people if she could help it. Danny smiled. It seemed genuine. "Nice to meet you, Margaret." Then, to her complete shock, he sat down on the steps beside her. Not too close, leaving a respectful distance between them, but close enough that the message was clear. He wasn't afraid of her. He didn't think she was beneath him. "I've seen you around," Danny said, looking out at the street. "You're always reading." "That's cool. Most people are just glued to their phones." Margaret didn't know what to say to that. She clutched her book a little tighter, waiting for whatever was coming next. The insult. The trick. The moment when this nice act would fall away and reveal something cruel underneath, but it didn't come. Instead, Danny just sat there with her for a few minutes, watching the cars go by and the people rushing past. He didn't ask her for anything. Didn't lecture her about getting help or finding a job or pulling herself up by her bootstraps. He just sat. "I should get going," he finally said, standing up and brushing off his jeans. "My mom's expecting me home. But hey, maybe I'll see you around again." Margaret nodded, still not quite believing this conversation had happened. "I'll take care, Margaret," Danny said. Then he walked away, heading down the street toward the residential neighborhoods beyond downtown. Margaret sat there long after he had disappeared from view, her book forgotten in her lap. For the first time in longer than she could remember, someone had treated her like a person, like someone worth talking to, like someone who existed. It was such a small thing. Just a few minutes of conversation on some church steps. But as the sun began to set and the October cold started to bite harder, Margaret found herself thinking about that boy and his kind eyes. She didn't dare hope it would happen again. Hope was dangerous when you had nothing. But somewhere deep inside, in a place she thought had died years ago, something small and fragile flickered to life. Maybe, just maybe, the world wasn't entirely cruel after all. Margaret didn't expect to see the boy again. People said nice things sometimes, made promises they never kept. That was just how it went. So when Friday afternoon came and she settled onto the same church steps with her book, she wasn't looking for him. She had learned a long time ago not to look for anything, but then she heard a voice. "Hey, Margaret." She glanced up, and there he was. Danny, walking toward her with that same open smile, his backpack slung over one shoulder. He was carrying a brown paper bag in his hand. "I thought I might find you here," he said, climbing the steps. "Mind if I sit?" Margaret shook her head, moving her cart slightly to make room. Her heart was beating faster than normal, though she couldn't quite say why. Maybe because it had been so long since anyone had sought her out on purpose. Maybe because she was afraid this kindness would disappear as quickly as it had come. Danny sat down and opened the paper bag. "I made an extra sandwich this morning," he said, pulling out 2 wrapped sandwiches. "Turkey and cheese. Hope that's okay?" He held one out to her. Margaret stared at it for a moment. She wanted to take it. She was hungry. She was always hungry, but something held her back. "You don't have to feel sorry for me," she said quietly. "I don't," Danny replied simply. "I just figured we could have lunch together. If you want." There was no pity in his eyes. No superior attitude. Just an honest offer. Margaret reached out slowly and took the sandwich. Her hands were shaking slightly. "Thank you," she whispered. They ate in comfortable silence for a few minutes. The sandwich was fresh, probably made that morning like he said. Real turkey, not the processed kind. Lettuce and tomato. It was the best thing Margaret had eaten in weeks. She tried not to eat it too quickly, tried to maintain some dignity, but it was difficult. "So what part are you at?" Danny asked, nodding toward her book. Margaret swallowed her bite. The part where he's in prison, planning his escape? Right, the Chateau d'If, Danny said. That's when he meets the priest, isn't it? The one who tells him about the treasure? Margaret felt something strange happen. She smiled. Actually smiled. The Abbe Faria. Yes. I loved that part, Danny said. The whole idea that even in the worst place imaginable, you could still find hope. Still find a way out. They talked about the book while they finished their sandwiches. Danny asked thoughtful questions, and Margaret found herself answering with more words than she had spoken in months. They discussed the themes of revenge and justice, whether the Count went too far, whether people could really change, or if they were stuck being who they'd always been. What do you think? Danny asked. Can people change? Margaret was quiet for a long moment. I think people can become someone they never thought they'd be, she finally said. Sometimes life just happens to you, and suddenly you're in a place you never imagined, and getting back seems impossible. Danny looked at her with those thoughtful eyes. But not actually impossible, he said gently. Just really, really hard. Margaret didn't respond to that. She wasn't ready to hope for anything beyond tomorrow. I have to get to work, Danny said, checking his phone. But same time next week? You work on Fridays? Margaret asked. Thursdays and Fridays? Danny said. 3 to 6. It's just shelving books and helping people find stuff, but I like it. Plus, Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, is really cool. She lets me read during slow times. He stood up and collected their trash. See you next Thursday, Margaret. And he did. Thursday came, and there was Danny again, with 2 sandwiches. They sat on the church steps and talked about books. Margaret told him about other stories she loved back when she could afford to buy books. Back when the library still felt like a place she belonged. Danny listened like every word mattered. Friday, he came back too. This pattern continued for 3 weeks. Every Thursday and Friday, Danny would find her, and they would share food and conversation. Sometimes they talked about books, sometimes about music. Danny was surprised when Margaret started discussing classical composers with the same passion she showed for literature. How do you know so much about Chopin? He asked one afternoon. Margaret's face went still. I used to listen to a lot of music, she said carefully. A long time ago. Danny sensed the boundary and didn't push, but he noticed things. The way Margaret's fingers sometimes moved as if playing invisible piano keys. The way her eyes got distant when she talked about certain pieces of music. The way she corrected his pronunciation of composers' names with gentle authority. By the 4th week, Danny's friends had started to notice his routine. Dude, why are you always rushing off? His friend Tyler asked after school one day. I've got work, Danny said. Yeah, but you've been acting weird, secretive. Danny hesitated. He didn't want to explain about Margaret because he knew how it would sound. He knew what people thought about homeless people. He'd heard the things his own parents said sometimes. Comments about personal responsibility and bad choices. I'm just helping someone out, he finally said. Tyler raised his eyebrows, but didn't ask more questions. That Thursday, Danny found Margaret in a different spot. She was in an alley between 2 buildings, her cart pulled close to her. Her eye was swollen, and there was a bruise forming on her cheek. What happened? Danny asked, his voice full of concern. Margaret shook her head. Some kids. Last night. They thought it would be funny to throw bottles at me while I was trying to sleep. It's fine. It happens. It's not fine, Danny said, anger rising in his chest. Not at Margaret, but at the cruelty of the world. Did you report it? Margaret almost laughed, though there was no humor in it. Report it to who? The police. They'd just tell me to move along like everyone else does. Danny sat down next to her, right there in the dirty alley. He opened his backpack and pulled out his lunch, same as always. 2 sandwiches, an apple. Some cookies his mom had packed. Here, he said, handing her the apple. It's supposed to help with bruising. The vitamin C or something? They sat together while Margaret ate slowly. Danny didn't try to fix everything with words. He just stayed. Sometimes that was all anyone could do. Why do you keep coming back? Margaret asked suddenly. Why do you care? Danny thought about it. My grandmother used to say that everyone has a story, that before you judge someone, you should try to understand their story. And I guess I just think your story matters, that you matter. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She turned away quickly, embarrassed. You don't know anything about me. I know you're smart, Danny said. I know you love books and music. I know you're kind, even though the world hasn't been kind to you. I know you're still here, still fighting, even when it would be easier to give up. That tells me a lot. They sat in silence for a while. Finally, Margaret spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I wasn't always like this. I had a life once. A real life. I believe you, Danny said simply. I was someone people respected, someone who mattered. You still matter, Danny said. You matter to me. Margaret looked at him then, really looked at him. This 17-year-old kid who had no reason to care about a homeless woman on the street, who gave up his lunch twice a week to sit with her, who listened like her words had value. Thank you, she said. And for the first time in 20 years, she felt like maybe, just maybe, she could trust someone again. Danny had a research paper due for his music history class. Nothing too complicated, just a presentation on a classical musician of his choice. Most kids were picking Mozart or Beethoven, the obvious choices. Danny wanted to find someone more interesting, someone his classmates might not know about. He was sitting at his computer late on a Tuesday night, scrolling through articles about classical pianists. His mom had already told him twice to go to bed, but he was determined to find the right person for his project. He clicked on a link about famous concert pianists of the 1990s. That's when he saw her. The photograph was old, probably from a newspaper archive, but there was no mistaking that face. Even though the woman in the picture was younger, her hair perfectly styled. Wearing an elegant black evening gown, Danny recognized her immediately. Margaret. His Margaret. The homeless woman he'd been sharing lunch with for the past month. But this Margaret was different. This Margaret stood on a stage, her hand resting on a grand piano, her face radiant with confidence and joy. The caption underneath read, Piano virtuoso Margaret Hayes captivates audience at Carnegie Hall. He clicked on another link, then another. Article after article appeared on his screen. Margaret Hayes performs with London Symphony Orchestra. Rising. Star Margaret Hayes releases critically acclaimed. Album Hayes brings standing. Ovation at Kennedy Center. The articles painted. Picture of someone extraordinary. A child prodigy who had started playing piano at age 4. A scholarship to Juilliard at 16. International tours by her early 20s. Critics called her mesmerizing and once in a generation. There were photographs of her shaking hands with famous conductors, signing autographs. Accepting awards, Danny sat back in his chair, his mind racing. How did someone go from that to living on the streets? What happened? He kept searching, going deeper into the archives. The articles about performances. Stopped suddenly in 2001. Danny found what he was looking for in a small news item from August of that year. Local concert pianist Margaret Hayes and her family were involved in a tragic accident on Highway 26 this evening. Hayes' husband, Robert Hayes, and their 15-year-old daughter, Catherine, were pronounced dead at the scene. Hayes was hospitalized with minor injuries. Danny felt like someone had punched him in the stomach. He kept reading, finding a few more mentions over the following months. Margaret had been released from the hospital. She had withdrawn from all scheduled performances. Her recording contract had been canceled. Then, nothing. She simply disappeared from the public eye. For the next hour, Danny searched for any trace of what happened to her after that. He found one interview from 2003 where a music journalist mentioned trying to contact her for a Where Are They Now piece. But she had never responded. Someone on a classical music forum from 2007 asked whatever happened to Margaret Hayes. The responses were all speculation. I heard she moved to Europe. Someone told me she quit music entirely, probably just retired to a quiet life somewhere.
Oh.
None of them knew the truth. That she was here, in Portland, pushing a shopping cart and sleeping in shelters. Danny didn't sleep much that night. He kept thinking about Margaret on that stage, so alive and vibrant. He thought about the Margaret he knew who flinched when people walked too close, who spoke in quiet voices, who seemed to expect the worst from everyone. The next day at school he couldn't concentrate. His mind kept drifting back to those photographs, to that newspaper article about the accident. He understood now why Margaret had become so still when he asked about music. Why her fingers moved like they were playing phantom keys. Why she knew so much about Chopin and Rachmaninoff and composers Danny had barely heard of. She hadn't just loved music. She had been music. Thursday couldn't come fast enough. Danny had both sandwiches packed, but his stomach was twisted in knots. Should he tell her he knew? Would she feel betrayed? Exposed? Would she stop trusting him? He found Margaret in her usual spot on the church steps. She was reading her book, and she looked up when she heard him approach. That small smile appearing on her face like it did now whenever she saw him. "Hello, Danny," she said. "Hey," he replied, sitting down next to her. He handed her a sandwich, and they unwrapped them together, like they always did. But today, Danny was quiet. Too quiet? Something wrong? Margaret asked after a few minutes. Danny took a breath. He had decided on the way over that he wouldn't lie to her. Their friendship was built on honesty even when the truth was hard. "I was doing research for a school project," he said slowly, "about classical musicians, and I found something." Margaret's hand stopped moving. She set down her sandwich and looked at him, her expression unreadable. "I found articles about you," Danny continued. "About your career, about what happened to your family. I'm sorry. I wasn't looking for you specifically. I just stumbled across it and I recognized your face." Margaret was very still. For a long moment she didn't say anything. Danny worried he had ruined everything, that she would get up and walk away and he'd never see her again. "So now you know," she finally said, her voice flat. "I know you were an incredible pianist," Danny said carefully. "I know you lost people you loved. I know you went through something terrible. Now you feel sorry for me," Margaret said. Poor, tragic Margaret. The fallen star. No, Danny said firmly. "I don't feel sorry for you. I mean, I'm sorry for what happened to you. That's different. But I don't pity you. I just understand better now." Margaret looked at him, her eyes searching his face for any sign of dishonesty or condescension. "Understand what? Why you are the way you are. Why you're so careful with people. Why music makes you sad." Danny paused. "I can't imagine losing everything like that. Your family, your career, your whole life." "I didn't just lose them," Margaret said quietly. "I lost myself. The person I was died that night too. I tried to keep going. I tried to play again. But every time I sat at a piano, all I could see was Catherine. She loved listening to me practice. She'd sit in the corner of the room doing her homework while I played. After the accident, I couldn't hear the music anymore. All I heard was silence where her voice should have been." Tears were running down her face now. Danny had never seen her cry before. "I stopped playing. Stopped performing. I couldn't pay the mortgage on the house. Too many memories anyway. I spent what money I had on nothing important, just trying to make it through each day. Then the money was gone. And then I was gone too. Margaret Hayes, the pianist, ceased to exist. I became just another invisible person on the street." "But you're not invisible," Danny said. "Not to me. You're just a kid," Margaret said, but there was no meanness in it. "You don't understand how the world works yet. People like me, we're disposable. We made bad choices, or got unlucky, and now we're paying for it. That's what everyone thinks." "I don't think that," Danny said. "And I don't think you're disposable. I think you're someone who survived something awful. You're still here. That takes strength." Margaret wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. "Why does it matter to you so much? Why do you care what happens to some homeless woman?" "Because everyone deserves to be seen," Danny said. "Everyone deserves to have someone who knows their story. And because I think you still have music in you, even if you can't hear it right now." Margaret shook her head. "That part of my life is over," maybe Danny said. "Or maybe it's just waiting for the right moment to come back." They sat together in silence after that. The afternoon sun was starting to set, casting long shadows across the church steps. Danny didn't have any solutions. He couldn't bring back Margaret's family. He couldn't erase 20 years of pain and loss, but he could sit with her. He could know her story and still see her as someone who mattered. "Thank you for not running away," Margaret finally said.
Why would I run away?
Danny asked. "Most people do. When they know the truth about me. When they realize I used to be someone, and now I'm nobody." "You're not nobody," Danny said firmly. "You never were." Danny couldn't stop thinking about what Margaret had told him. For days after their conversation, he kept imagining her at a piano, playing for audiences around the world. Then he'd see her on those church steps with her worn-out clothes and broken shopping cart, and his chest would ache. There had to be something he could do. Something that could help her find her way back. Even just a little bit. On Monday morning at school, Danny was distracted during his classes. His teacher called on him twice in history, and he had no idea what the question was. His best friend Kevin nudged him at lunch. "You okay, man?" "You've been weird lately. Just thinking about stuff," Danny said. That afternoon, he went to work at the library like always. Mrs. Chen, the head librarian, was sorting through donations at the front desk. She was in her 60s, with kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and a sharp mind that never forgot a detail. "Danny, you're early," she said, looking up at him. "Everything all right?" Danny hesitated. Mrs. Chen had always been easy to talk to. She treated him like an adult, not just some kid who shelved books. "Can I ask you something?" He said, "Of course." Mrs. Chen set down the book she was holding and gave him her full attention. Danny told her about Margaret. Not everything, but enough. About how they'd become friends, how Margaret loved books and music, how she'd once been a concert pianist. Mrs. Chen listened without interrupting, nodding occasionally. "And now I just keep thinking," Danny said, "that she gave up something she loved because it hurt too much. But maybe if she could just play again, even once, it might help somehow. I don't know. Maybe that's stupid." "It's not stupid," Mrs. Chen said gently. "It's compassionate. But Danny, you need to understand something important. You can't fix Margaret's pain. No one can. That's something she has to work through herself." "I know," Danny said. "But what if there was a way to just remind her that music is still there? That she doesn't have to be afraid of it?" Mrs. Chen was quiet for a moment, thinking. "We're having our community talent showcase in 3 weeks," she finally said. "Remember? We do it every year. It's open to everyone in the neighborhood. Anyone can sign up to perform." Danny's eyes widened. "You think Margaret would do it?" "I think Mrs. Chen said carefully that you could extend the invitation. Whether she accepts is entirely up to her. But sometimes people need to know they're welcome before they can take the first step." That night, Danny lay in bed thinking about how to approach Margaret. He couldn't just say, "Hey, want to play piano in front of a bunch of strangers?" She'd shut down completely. He needed to be gentle about it. Strategic. The next Thursday, he brought their sandwiches as usual. Margaret was in better spirits than she'd been the week before. She'd found a jacket at a donation center that actually fit her properly, and she seemed almost proud of it. "Look at this," she said, showing him the zipper. "It actually works. Both ways." Danny smiled. "That's great, Margaret." They ate their lunch and talked about small things. The weather. A book Margaret had started reading. A funny customer, Danny, had helped at the library who couldn't remember whether she wanted a book about gardening or a book about gambling. Then, as casually as he could manage, Danny said, "Hey, the library is doing this community thing in a few weeks. A talent showcase. People performing music, reading poetry, stuff like that. It's pretty low-key." Margaret's expression became guarded. "That's nice." Mrs. Chen mentioned they'd love to have more performers, especially musicians. Danny kept his voice light, non-pressuring. "I thought of you." "No," Margaret said immediately, shaking her head. "Absolutely not," Danny said simply. He didn't push. Not yet. But he brought it up again the next week. And the week after that? Never demanding. Never guilting her. Just mentioning it, letting her know the offer stood. "You don't have to perform for an audience," he said during their third conversation about it. "Maybe you could just come to the library after hours sometime." just to see if you still remember how it feels. No pressure. No expectations. Why are you doing this? Margaret asked, frustrated. Why can't you just leave it alone? Because Danny said honestly, I heard you humming last week. When you were reading, it was chopping. You didn't even realize you were doing it. And I thought, there's still music inside you. Even after everything, it's still there. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. It hurts too much. I know, Danny said, but maybe avoiding it hurts too. 2 more weeks passed. The talent showcase was now just 5 days away. Danny had stopped mentioning it, figuring he'd pushed as much as he could. If Margaret didn't want to face a piano again, that was her choice. He'd still bring her sandwiches. He'd still be her friend. Then, on a Friday evening, just after 6, Danny was about to leave the library when he heard a knock on the side door. The library was officially closed. But Mrs. Chen had asked him to stay late to help reorganize the children's section. He opened the door, and there stood Margaret. She looked terrified. Is it too late? She whispered. To see the piano? Danny's heart jumped. No, it's not too late. Come in. He led her through the quiet library to the community room. In the corner sat an old upright piano that had been donated years ago. It was out of tune and missing some of the polish from its glory days, but it still worked. Margaret stood in the doorway, staring at it like it might bite her. Take your time, Danny said. There's no rush. She took 1 step forward, then another. Her hand reached out and touched the piano's wooden surface, and she pulled back like it burned. But then she touched it again, letting her fingers rest there. I don't know if I can do this, she said. You don't have to, Danny replied. But if you want to try, I'm here. Margaret pulled out the bench and sat down slowly. Her hands hovered over the keys, shaking. Danny could see her chest rising and falling with rapid breaths. She was having a panic attack. Maybe I should go, she started to say, beginning to stand. Wait, Danny said gently. Just try 1 note. That's all. Just 1. Margaret looked at him. Then, with a trembling finger, she pressed down on middle C. The sound filled the room. Clear and pure, despite the piano being slightly out of tune. She closed her eyes. A tear ran down her cheek. Then she pressed another key. And another. Slowly, haltingly, a melody began to emerge. Danny recognized it after a moment. It was Chopin's Nocturne, the one she'd been humming. Her hands began to remember. 20 years fell away, and muscle memory took over. The music wasn't perfect. She stumbled over notes. Her timing was off. She had to stop and restart several times. But it was beautiful. Heartbreaking and beautiful. Danny stood frozen, afraid to move, afraid to break whatever spell had taken hold of her. Mrs. Chen appeared in the doorway, drawn by the sound. She put her hand over her heart and said nothing. Margaret played for 10 minutes. When she finally stopped, her hands dropped into her lap, and she sat there crying. Not sad crying exactly. Something more complicated than that. Grief and relief and fear all mixed together. I didn't forget, she whispered. I thought I'd forgotten, but I didn't. No, Danny said softly. You didn't forget. Mrs. Chen walked over and gently placed her hand on Margaret's shoulder. That was extraordinary, she said. Truly extraordinary. Margaret looked up at her, then at Danny. I don't think I can do this in front of people. You don't have to decide right now, Mrs. Chen said. The showcase is Tuesday evening. If you want to play, we'd be honored. If you don't, this room is open to you any time you want to practice. No questions asked. Over the weekend, Danny wondered what Margaret would decide. He wanted her to perform, to show the world she was still remarkable, still talented, still somebody. But he also understood if she couldn't. Some wounds were too deep. Monday afternoon, Danny got a text from Mrs. Chen. Margaret came by this morning. She played for 2 hours. I think she's going to do it. Tuesday evening arrived. The community room was set up with folding chairs. People were filtering in, neighbors and library regulars, families with kids, elderly couples who came to every library event. Danny waited by the door, watching for Margaret. 6 o'clock came and went. The showcase started. A teenage girl sang a pop song. 2 kids played recorders. An older man read a poem he'd written. Danny kept checking the door. Maybe she couldn't do it after all. Maybe it was too much too soon. Then, at 6:45, he saw her. Margaret stood outside, visible through the glass door, still wearing her donated jacket, but with her hair combed neat. She looked absolutely terrified. Danny went to the door and opened it. "I can't," Margaret said. "I thought I could, but there are too many people." "That's okay," Danny said. "You tried. That's what matters." But Mrs. Chen had seen them. She walked over calmly. "Margaret," she said quietly, "you don't have to perform. But could I ask you to do me a favor? Could you just come sit at the piano? Just for a moment. You don't have to play." Margaret looked between them. Then, with Danny on one side and Mrs. Chen on the other, she walked into that room. Margaret's legs felt like they might give out as she walked toward the piano. Every face in the room turned to look at her. She could see the confusion in their eyes. Some people whispered to each other. A homeless woman was about to sit at their piano, Mrs. Chen announced in a clear voice. "Our next performer is Margaret Hayes." No introduction, no explanation. Just her name, spoken with dignity and respect. Margaret sat down on the bench. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together in her lap. She stared at the keys and saw her daughter's face. Heard her voice. "Play the pretty one, Mom. The one that sounds like rain." She couldn't do this. She had made a terrible mistake. Then she felt Danny's presence behind her. He didn't touch her or say anything. He just stood there, a quiet reminder that she wasn't alone. Margaret took a deep breath. She placed her hands on the keys, and she began to play. The first notes of Chopin's Nocturne in E-flat major filled the room. Her fingers stumbled at first, uncertain, but then something ancient and powerful took over. The music poured out of her like water from a broken dam. All the grief she'd carried for 20 years. All the loss. All the love she'd had for her family and for the art that had once defined her. The room went completely silent. Even the restless children stopped fidgeting. People sat frozen in their chairs, barely breathing. This woman they had never noticed before created something transcendent right in front of them. Margaret's eyes were closed. Tears streamed down her face, but she kept playing. Her hands remembered every note, every dynamic, every subtle shift in tempo. She wasn't performing anymore. She was pouring her heart out, telling her story the only way she knew how. When the final notes faded into silence, no one moved. The moment stretched on, fragile and sacred. Then someone started clapping. Then another person. Then the entire room erupted in applause. People stood up, giving her a standing ovation. Some were crying too. Margaret opened her eyes and looked out at all those faces. They weren't looking at her with disgust or pity anymore. They were looking at her with awe, with respect, with recognition of what they'd just witnessed. Mrs. Chen walked over and hugged her. "Thank you," she whispered. "Thank you for sharing that with us." Danny was grinning, tears on his own cheeks. Margaret reached out and squeezed his hand. She couldn't speak. If she tried to talk, she would completely break down. After the showcase ended, people came up to her. They introduced themselves. They told her how beautiful her playing was. An elderly woman said it reminded her of a concert she'd attended 50 years ago in Vienna. A young mother said her daughter had stopped crying the moment the music started. One man in his 40s approached hesitantly. "I'm a music teacher at Jefferson High School," he said. "I have to ask, where did you train?" That was extraordinary. Margaret looked at him for a long moment. "Juilliard," she said quietly. "A very long time ago." His eyes widened. "Would you ever consider teaching? Even just a few students? We have a piano at the school that barely gets used." Margaret didn't answer right away. The thought of teaching, of being responsible for shaping young musicians, felt impossible. But it also felt like something stirring deep inside her. Something that might resemble hope. "Let me think about it," she said. As people left, Danny helped Mrs. Chen stack chairs. Margaret sat on the piano bench, running her fingers lightly over the keys. She felt exhausted, hollowed out, but also somehow lighter than she'd felt in decades. "You were amazing," Danny said, coming to sit next to her. "I was terrified," Margaret admitted. "I know, but you did it anyway." Over the next few days, something unexpected happened. A woman who'd been at the showcase wrote a blog post about the performance. She was a local journalist, and she'd recognized Margaret's name from old concert programs she'd collected. She wrote about the mysterious pianist who had disappeared from the classical music world decades ago and had resurfaced playing at a library talent show. The post went viral suddenly. Margaret's story was everywhere. Local news stations wanted interviews. Classical music forums were buzzing with speculation. People who had seen her perform years ago couldn't believe she was alive and still playing. Margaret was overwhelmed. She met with Danny and Mrs. Chen in the library's back office, away from the reporters who had started showing up. "I don't want to be famous again," she said, her voice shaking. "I can't handle that. I just want to be left alone." "You don't have to talk to anyone you don't want to," Mrs. Chen assured her. "But Margaret, people are offering help. Real help. There's a woman from a housing nonprofit who called, a lawyer who specializes in helping people get back on their feet, a therapist who works with trauma survivors. They want to help you, not exploit you." Margaret was quiet. She'd spent so long being invisible, being nobody, that the idea of people caring about her well-being felt foreign and frightening. "What do you want?" Danny asked gently. "Not what you think you deserve or what you think is possible. What do you actually want?" Margaret closed her eyes. "I want a safe place to sleep. I want to not be cold all the time. I want to play piano without having a panic attack. I want to feel like a person again." "Let's start there," Mrs. Chen said. "One step at a time." Over the following months, things slowly changed for Margaret. The housing nonprofit found her a small studio apartment in a subsidized building. It wasn't fancy, but it was clean and warm and hers. A local music store donated a keyboard so she could practice at home. The therapist Mrs. Chen had mentioned agreed to see her pro bono. Helping her work through the trauma she'd carried for so long, Margaret started teaching piano. 3 days a week at Jefferson High School. Just a few students at first. She was rusty at teaching, and some days the memories were too heavy to bear. But the students were patient with her, and she found that she actually enjoyed it. Enjoyed seeing young people discover the same magic in music that she'd once felt. Danny visited her apartment. One Saturday afternoon, it was sparse. Just a bed, a small table, the keyboard, and some books. But there were curtains on the window that Margaret had picked out herself. A plant on the windowsill that she was learning to care for. Small signs of a life being rebuilt. "How are you doing?" he asked. Margaret smiled. It was a real smile, not the careful, guarded one she used to wear. "Some days are hard," she admitted. "I still have nightmares. I still miss them every single day. But I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm actually living. I'm proud of you," Danny said. "I'm proud of me too," Margaret said, and she meant it. "But Danny, none of this would have happened if you hadn't seen me. Really seen me. When I was invisible to everyone else, you treated me like I mattered." "You did matter," Danny said. "You always did." 6 months after the talent showcase, Margaret gave her first real concert in 20 years. It was small, held at the library, a benefit for homeless services. She played 3 pieces, including the Chopin Nocturne that had brought her back to music. Danny sat in the front row with his parents, who had finally understood why their son had been so committed to helping a stranger. Mrs. Chen sat next to them, beaming with pride. The music teacher from Jefferson High was there with several of Margaret's students. When Margaret finished playing, the applause was thunderous. But the most meaningful moment came afterward, when a teenage girl approached her shyly. "I'm homeless too," the girl whispered, so quietly only Margaret could hear. "I saw the article about you. I just wanted to say thank you for showing me that things can get better." Margaret hugged her tightly. "They can," she said. "They really can. It's hard and it's slow, and some days you'll want to give up. But there are good people in the world. People who will see you when everyone else looks away." That night, As Margaret rode the bus back to her apartment, she thought about how far she'd come. She wasn't the person she'd been before the accident. That Margaret was gone forever, and she'd finally made peace with that. But she wasn't the invisible woman on the church steps anymore either. She was something new. Something built from tragedy and survival and unexpected kindness. She was someone who had been broken and was slowly, carefully putting herself back together. Not perfect, not fixed, but whole enough. When she got home, she sat at her keyboard and played in the dark. Not for an audience, not for applause, just for herself and for the daughter who used to sit in the corner and listen. The music sounded like rain, gentle and cleansing, washing away years of silence. And for the first time in 2 decades, Margaret Hayes felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be.